The Beechcraft Baron climbed steadily through the thin Colorado air, its twin engines humming in perfect synchronization as Cedar Ridge fell away below like a miniature model town. At 10,000 feet, the Rocky Mountain peaks stretched endlessly. In every direction, their snow-capped summits catching the afternoon sun in brilliant white flashes. Inside the cockpit, 26-year-old Chloe Brennan gripped the yoke with white knuckles, her breathing shallow and rapid as the altimeter continued its relentless climb. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Steady on the controls, Brennan," barked Tyler Hawkins from the right seat, his voice cutting through the engine noise with practiced authority. "You're over-controlling again. How many times do I have to tell you that finesse beats force every time?" His designer aviator sunglasses reflected the instrument panel as he shook his head in theatrical disappointment. "Maybe stick to the Cessnas until you figure out how real aircraft work." The comment drew snickers from Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher, two advanced students crammed into the rear seats who had volunteered to observe today's training flight. Tyler had specifically invited them along, claiming it would be educational to watch a struggling student work through complex maneuvers. What they were witnessing instead was a masterclass in public humiliation at altitude. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she fought to maintain straight and level flight, but something else flickered across her features in that moment. Her eyes, usually downcast during Tyler's critiques, sharpened with a focus that seemed oddly professional. For just an instant, her grip on the controls shifted to something more confident, more precise, before she caught herself and returned to the hesitant movements Tyler expected to see. None of the men noticed the brief transformation. They were too busy enjoying the show. "Watch this," Tyler announced to his audience, reaching over to suddenly reduce power on both engines without warning. "Emergency descent scenario. Let's see if our student pilot can handle a little pressure." The Baron's nose dropped sharply as airspeed began to decay, and Tyler leaned back with a satisfied smirk. "Clock's ticking, Brennan. What's your move?" What happened in the next few seconds would later be dissected and discussed throughout the mountain aviation community for months to come. As Chloe's training kicked in and her hands moved with sudden fluid precision across the instrument panel, Tyler's expression began to change from smug satisfaction to something approaching confusion. But that was only the beginning of a day that would reveal just how wrong assumptions could be about the quiet woman who cleaned aircraft engines by day and flew training flights on weekends. Chloe Brennan had always preferred the company of aircraft to people, and on most days, that arrangement worked perfectly for everyone involved. At Skyward Aviation Academy, nestled in the shadow of Colorado's Front Range, she was known as the quiet student who paid her bills on time, showed up early for flights, and never complained when instructors canceled last minute or relegated her to the oldest, most temperamental training aircraft in the fleet. What her fellow students and instructors didn't know was that Chloe's preference for solitude had been carefully cultivated over the past 3 years, ever since she'd traded her Air Force uniform for civilian clothes and a deliberate anonymity that allowed her to rebuild her life on her own terms. The transition from senior airman Chloe Brennan, remotely piloted aircraft specialist with the 432nd Wing at Creech Air Force Base, to simply Chloe, the aircraft maintenance technician at Rocky Mountain Charter Services, had been more jarring than she'd anticipated. Her small apartment on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge reflected this careful simplicity. Sparse furnishings, a few technical manuals scattered on a second-hand coffee table, and a single framed photograph of her grandmother tucked discreetly on a bookshelf. What visitors wouldn't see was the locked metal box beneath her bed containing military commendations, advanced flight certifications, and documentation of over 2,000 hours piloting some of the most sophisticated unmanned aircraft in the U.S. military arsenal. The decision to pursue civilian pilot training had come gradually, born from a restlessness that her day job maintaining charter aircraft engines couldn't quite satisfy. Working with her hands on the mechanical systems felt grounding after years of flying missions through computer screens and satellite links, but something essential was missing. The sky called to her in a way that ground-based work never could, and civilian flight training seemed like a natural bridge between her military past and whatever future she was still trying to define. Skyward Aviation Academy had seemed like the perfect choice when she'd first visited 18 months ago. The school boasted modern aircraft, experienced instructors, and a training program that promised to take students from 0 hours to commercial pilot certification. What the brochures hadn't mentioned was the pervasive culture of casual sexism and elitism that made the place feel more like an exclusive club than a professional training environment. Tyler Hawkins embodied everything Chloe had learned to navigate carefully in her civilian life. At 32, he was the school's most senior instructor and the owner's nephew. Facts he mentioned frequently during ground school sessions and social gatherings at the airport's small restaurant. His 3,000 hours of flight time and commercial pilot credentials were undeniably impressive, as was his collection of expensive watches and his habit of parking his BMW in the spot closest to the flight line. What made him truly dangerous, however, was his talent for identifying students' insecurities and exploiting them with surgical precision. Chloe had first encountered Tyler's teaching methods during her initial checkout in the school's Cessna 172. She'd been nervous that day, her military flying experience feeling irrelevant in the cramped cockpit of the single-engine trainer. Her landings were tentative, her radio calls stilted, and her overall performance reflected the uncertainty of someone trying to translate one type of flying experience into another entirely different context. Not bad for a first-timer, Tyler had said after they'd taxied back to the ramp, his tone suggesting anything but praise. Course, some people take to flying naturally, and others. He'd let the sentence hang as he made notes in her training record. We'll get you sorted out eventually. Might take a while longer than some students, but hey, not everyone's cut out to be a pilot. The comment had stung more than Chloe cared to admit, partly because it echoed her own doubts about transitioning to civilian aviation, but mostly because it was so fundamentally wrong. She'd spent 5 years flying complex missions in contested airspace, making split-second decisions that affected ground operations and potentially saved lives. But here, struggling with the unfamiliar sight picture of a Cessna's approach profile, she was just another student pilot who needed extra work on her landings. As her training progressed, Tyler's criticism became more targeted and public. During ground school sessions, he would use her questions as examples of fundamental misunderstandings, often rephrasing her inquiries in ways that made them sound naive or ill-informed. In the aircraft, his instruction took on an increasingly condescending tone, particularly when other students or instructors were within earshot. Brennan's having trouble with radio work again. He'd announce over the intercom during pattern practice, his voice broadcast to anyone monitoring the frequency. Some people just don't have the multitasking ability this job requires. The comment would inevitably draw knowing glances from other pilots in the pattern, creating a cumulative effect that gradually marginalized her within the school's tight-knit community. The pattern extended beyond Tyler's direct instruction. Other students, taking their cues from the school's star instructor, began treating Chloe with a mixture of pity and dismissal. During pre-flight briefings, they would explain basic concepts she already understood, assuming her quiet demeanor indicated confusion rather than careful attention. In the pilot lounge, conversations would pause when she entered, then resume with pointed discussions about challenging maneuvers or advanced ratings that carried the implicit suggestion that such topics were beyond her current capabilities. Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher, both working toward their commercial licenses under Tyler's guidance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Had developed a particularly annoying habit of offering unsolicited advice about her flying technique. Their suggestions, delivered with the confident authority of pilots who'd never faced anything more challenging than crosswind landings at a controlled airport, often contradicted the systematic approach Chloe had learned during her military training. "You know, Chloe," Jake had said after watching her pre-flight inspection one morning, "you're spending way too much time on that checklist. Real pilots develop a flow that's much more efficient." His critique ignored the fact that Chloe's thorough inspection had caught a loose oil cap that could have led to engine failure, focusing instead on the extra 2 minutes her caution had required. The social dynamics at Skyward Academy reflected broader patterns Chloe had encountered throughout the aviation community in Cedar Ridge. The Mountain Pilots Association, which met monthly at the airport restaurant, was dominated by retired airline pilots and successful business owners who flew expensive aircraft and spoke in a kind of professional shorthand that excluded newcomers. When Chloe had attended her first meeting, hoping to connect with local pilots and learn about mountain flying techniques, she'd found herself relegated to a corner table with other student pilots while the experienced aviators shared war stories and discussed advanced topics at the main tables. Captain Bill Hawkins, Tyler's uncle and the school's owner, had built Skyward Aviation's reputation on his own impressive background as a former military transport pilot and airline captain. His office walls displayed photographs from his flying career alongside certificates and awards that spoke to decades of professional aviation experience. Unfortunately, his management style seemed to rely heavily on maintaining clear hierarchies and traditional approaches that didn't always account for the changing demographics of people entering aviation. During Chloe's progress reviews, Captain Hawkins would listen politely to Tyler's assessments, while reviewing her training records with the detached professionalism of someone evaluating a marginal investment. "Some students need more time to develop confidence," he'd say, echoing his nephew's evaluations. "Flying isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in discovering that civilian aviation might not be the right fit." The suggestion that she might not belong in aviation stung more deeply than Captain Hawkins could have realized. Chloe's grandmother, the woman whose photograph occupied the place of honor in her sparse apartment, had been one of the women Air Force service pilots during World War II. Eleanor Brennan had ferried military aircraft across the country, tested experimental modifications, and trained male pilots who would later fly combat missions, all while facing discrimination and skepticism about women's capabilities in aviation. Eleanor had lived to see her granddaughter commission as an Air Force officer and earn her pilot wings, but she'd passed away during Chloe's second deployment, leaving behind a legacy of quiet determination and a handwritten letter that Chloe still carried in her flight bag. "The sky doesn't care about your gender, your background, or what other people think you can do," Eleanor had written. "It only cares about your skill, your judgment, and your respect for the forces you're working with. Trust yourself, trust your training, and remember that the best pilots are often the ones who speak the least and listen the most." The letter had sustained Chloe through challenging moments in her military career, and it continued to provide guidance as she navigated the civilian aviation world. But there were days when Tyler's constant criticism and the school's dismissive atmosphere made her question whether the transition to civilian flying was worth the frustration and self-doubt it seemed to generate. Her job at Rocky Mountain Charter Services provided some respite from the tensions at Skyward Academy. As a maintenance technician, she worked on a variety of aircraft, from small single-engine planes used for mountain tours to larger turboprops that carried passengers to Denver and beyond. The work was satisfying in a tangible way that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. Engines were logical, mechanical systems responded predictably to proper maintenance, and there was clear satisfaction in returning a grounded aircraft to airworthy status. Tommy Rodriguez, the chief mechanic at Rocky Mountain Charter, had quickly recognized Chloe's unusual competence with complex systems. Her military training in avionics and electronic warfare systems translated well to civilian aircraft maintenance, and she often found herself troubleshooting problems that stumped more experienced technicians. Tommy had begun assigning her to the more challenging repairs, trusting her diagnostic skills and attention to detail in ways that felt refreshingly different from her experience as a student pilot. "You've got good instincts," Tommy had told her after she'd successfully traced an intermittent electrical fault that had grounded one of the charter service's twin-engine aircraft. "Ever think about pursuing an A&P license? You'd make a hell of a maintenance supervisor." The suggestion had been gratifying, but it also highlighted the disconnect between her capabilities and her current status as a struggling student pilot. Lisa Chang, one of the charter service's pilots, had also noticed Chloe's unusual familiarity with aircraft systems. During routine maintenance conversations, Chloe would occasionally offer insights into flight characteristics or system interactions that went beyond typical maintenance knowledge. Lisa had begun inviting her to observe pre-flight procedures and systems checks, sensing that Chloe's interest went deeper than simple professional curiosity. "You know a lot about flying for someone who's still working on her private license," Lisa had observed during one of these informal sessions. "Some of your questions sound like they're coming from someone with more experience than your logbook shows." The comment had been friendly rather than suspicious, but it reminded Chloe how carefully she needed to maintain the boundaries between her past and present identities. The dual existence was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. At work, she was valued for her technical expertise and problem-solving abilities. At flight training, she was treated as someone who might never develop the skills necessary for safe pilot operations. The disconnect created a cognitive dissonance that left her feeling frustrated and isolated, caught between a past she was trying to leave behind and a future she wasn't sure she could achieve on civilian terms. Things came to a head during a particularly challenging lesson in instrument flying procedures. Tyler had been demonstrating approaches in simulated low-visibility conditions, using foggles to restrict Chloe's vision to the instrument panel while he provided verbal guidance and monitored her progress. The exercise was designed to build confidence in flying solely by reference to instruments, a critical skill for any pilot planning to fly in weather conditions or complex airspace. Chloe's performance had been flawless. Her altitude control was precise, her navigation was accurate, and her approach procedure followed published guidelines exactly. But Tyler had found fault with her scan pattern, claiming that her instrument interpretation was too slow and mechanical for practical flying conditions. "Real instrument flying requires intuitive understanding," he'd lectured as they flew back to Cedar Ridge. "You can follow procedures all day long, but if you can't develop that pilot instinct, you'll never be safe in actual conditions." His critique ignored the fact that Chloe's systematic approach was exactly what professional pilots used in challenging conditions, focusing instead on stylistic preferences that reflected his own training background. The breaking point came when Tyler announced that he was recommending additional instrument training before Chloe could progress to her check ride preparation. The recommendation would add weeks to her training timeline and hundreds of dollars to her costs, all based on his subjective assessment that her flying technique lacked the intuitive feel he deemed necessary for pilot certification. That evening, alone in her apartment, Chloe had pulled out her grandmother's letter and read it again, trying to find guidance for a situation Eleanor could never have anticipated. The words about trusting herself and her training resonated differently. Now filtered through months of systematic doubt and professional criticism that had gradually eroded her confidence in ways that combat missions never had. She made a decision that night that would ultimately change everything. Instead of accepting Tyler's assessment and extending her training, she would request a different instructor for her remaining lessons. Captain Hawkins might question the change, and Tyler would certainly take it as a personal affront, But she needed to complete her training in an environment where her abilities could be evaluated fairly rather than prejudged, based on preconceptions about her capabilities. The request, when she made it the following morning, created exactly the kind of controversy she'd hoped to avoid. Tyler's reaction was immediate and public, his voice carrying across the pilot lounge as he expressed his professional opinion that changing instructors at this stage of training was usually a sign that a student wasn't willing to accept constructive criticism. "Some people just can't handle honest feedback," he announced to anyone within earshot. "They'd rather shop around for an instructor who'll tell them what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear." His comments were clearly designed to frame Chloe's request as evidence of deficient character rather than legitimate concerns about instructional effectiveness. Captain Hawkins had listened to Chloe's request with the polite but skeptical attention of someone accustomed to mediating disputes between students and instructors. His questions focused primarily on Tyler's teaching methods rather than Chloe's specific concerns, and his ultimate decision to approve the instructor change came with a warning that further complaints about instruction would be viewed as evidence that civilian aviation might not be the right career path for her. The new instructor assigned to complete Chloe's training was David Cross, a quiet former airline pilot who'd recently joined Skyward Academy after taking early retirement from a major carrier. David's approach to instruction was methodical and encouraging, focusing on building student confidence rather than highlighting deficiencies. His first flight with Chloe revealed capabilities that Tyler had either missed or deliberately minimized. In his training reports, "Your flying is actually quite good," David told her after their initial evaluation flight. "I'm not sure why your previous instructor was recommending additional training. Your technique is sound, your decision-making is solid, and your procedures are more precise than most students I work with." His assessment was professional and objective, based on observable performance rather than subjective interpretations of flying style. Working with David over the following weeks restored much of Chloe's confidence in her abilities and her decision to pursue civilian flying. His instruction focused on refining techniques she already understood rather than rebuilding fundamental skills from scratch, and his feedback was specific and constructive rather than broadly critical. Under his guidance, she began to feel like the competent pilot her military experience suggested she could become. But Tyler's influence at Skyward Academy extended beyond his direct instruction, and Chloe soon discovered that requesting a different instructor had marked her as a troublemaker. Within the school's informal social hierarchy, Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher, still working toward their commercial ratings under Tyler's guidance, began treating her with open hostility rather than condescending pity. Their comments in the pilot lounge became more pointed, their offers of unsolicited advice more aggressive, and their general behavior suggested that they viewed her instructor change as a betrayal of some unspoken loyalty code. The situation deteriorated further when Tyler began making subtle but unmistakable suggestions that Chloe's training progress under David was somehow illegitimate or artificially accelerated. During safety meetings and ground school sessions, he would make comments about the importance of maintaining consistent standards across all instructors, implying that some instructors might be more willing to overlook deficiencies than others. "We have a responsibility to the aviation community," Tyler would say during these discussions, his eyes finding Chloe in the audience with obvious intent. "Passing students who aren't truly ready doesn't do anyone any favors, especially when they find themselves in situations that exceed their actual capabilities." His comments were technically directed at general principles, but everyone understood their specific target. The tension at Skyward Aviation Academy reached a crescendo on a crisp October morning when Tyler Hawkins made an announcement that would change everything. Standing before the assembled students and instructors in the cramped briefing room, he outlined plans for what he called the Ultimate Skills Challenge, a comprehensive evaluation designed to separate serious aviators from Weekend hobbyists. Real pilots prove themselves under pressure, Tyler declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. This isn't about logging hours or memorizing procedures. This is about demonstrating actual competence. When conditions get challenging and margins get thin. His eyes swept across the room, lingering meaningfully on Chloe as she sat quietly in the back row. The challenge would consist of multiple phases designed to test different aspects of pilot skill and judgment. Cross-country navigation without GPS, precision approaches in simulated low visibility, emergency procedures under pressure, and mountain flying techniques specific to Colorado's demanding terrain. Tyler emphasized that participation was voluntary, but his tone suggested that declining would be viewed as an admission of inadequacy. We've had too many students lately who think they can slide by with minimum standards, Tyler continued, his commentary clearly directed despite its general phrasing. This challenge will identify who really belongs in professional aviation, and who might be better suited to other pursuits. The implicit threat was unmistakable to everyone present, particularly to Chloe, who realized she was being maneuvered into a public test she couldn't refuse without confirming every doubt Tyler had planted about her capabilities. Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher exchanged knowing glances, their expressions suggesting they were already privy to Tyler's plans and confident about their own prospects. Other students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the challenge as something far beyond typical training requirements, but uncertain about the consequences of declining participation. Captain Hawkins, observing from the corner of the briefing room, nodded approvingly at his nephew's initiative. Excellent idea, Tyler. Nothing builds character like a little healthy competition. His endorsement effectively transformed the voluntary challenge into a mandatory demonstration for any student hoping to maintain standing at the school. David Cross, who had been reviewing weather reports during Tyler's announcement, looked up with obvious concern. Some of these scenarios seem quite advanced for student pilots, he said carefully. Are we certain about the safety margins? His question reflected the professional caution of someone with actual emergency experience, but Tyler dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Safety is exactly why we need to test these skills properly, Tyler responded. Better to discover limitations in a controlled environment than during an actual emergency. His logic was superficially reasonable, but David's expression suggested he recognized the underlying agenda behind the professional justification. That afternoon, Chloe found herself studying the challenge requirements in detail, recognizing elements that would be familiar to any military pilot, but potentially overwhelming for civilian student aviators. The cross-country navigation phase required pilotage and dead reckoning techniques that most modern pilots never developed, relying instead on GPS and electronic navigation aids. The emergency procedures included scenarios like engine failures at low altitude, electrical system malfunctions, and simulated instrument failures that demanded split-second decision-making and precise aircraft control. Most concerning was the mountain flying component, which included high-altitude operations, density-altitude calculations, and terrain avoidance procedures that were genuinely dangerous for inexperienced pilots. Tyler had structured the challenge to highlight exactly the kinds of skills where military training provided significant advantages, almost as if he suspected something about Chloe's background and was designing a test to expose it. Lisa Chang, the charter pilot who had noticed Chloe's unusual technical knowledge, approached her in the maintenance hangar that evening with obvious concern. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. Tyler's challenge isn't about education or safety. It's about proving a point, and you're the point he's trying to prove. Chloe appreciated the warning, but she also recognized that backing down would confirm every suspicion Tyler had voiced about her commitment and capabilities. More importantly, some part of her was curious to see how her military experience would translate to civilian flying challenges, particularly in an environment where she could finally demonstrate her actual skills rather than hiding them. "I've been flying longer than people realize," Chloe said carefully, choosing her words to acknowledge her experience without revealing specifics about her background. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending I don't know what I'm doing." The comment surprised Lisa, who had sensed hidden depths but hadn't anticipated such direct acknowledgement. Word of Chloe's participation spread quickly through the aviation community, generating exactly the kind of attention she had spent months trying to avoid. Local pilots who frequented the airport restaurant began discussing the challenge with the amused interest of spectators anticipating entertainment. The consensus seemed to be that Tyler's challenge would finally expose the quiet maintenance technician's limitations and subtle questions about whether she belonged in the cockpit. Tommy Rodriguez, her supervisor at Rocky Mountain Charter, overheard some of these conversations and sought out Chloe with genuine concern about her decision to participate. "You don't owe anyone proof of anything," he told her during a quiet moment in the maintenance shop. "These guys are playing games that have nothing to do with actual flying ability." But Chloe had already made her decision, influenced partly by her grandmother's letter about trust in her training and partly by a growing frustration with constantly hiding her capabilities. The challenge would either vindicate her place at Skyward Academy or provide a definitive reason to find training elsewhere, but either outcome seemed preferable to the current situation. Tyler's behavior in the days leading up to the challenge became increasingly theatrical, as if he were building anticipation for a performance he was confident would validate his assessment of Chloe's limitations. During ground school sessions, he began incorporating scenarios similar to those in the upcoming challenge, always using examples that highlighted potential failure modes and the importance of extensive experience in handling complex situations. "Emergency situations reveal who you really are as a pilot," Tyler lectured, his gaze finding Chloe with unmistakable intent. "All the book learning in the world doesn't prepare you for the moment when everything goes wrong and you have to rely on pure instinct and experience." His emphasis on experience was clearly designed to underscore what he saw as Chloe's fundamental disadvantage. Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher had begun treating the challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate their own superiority, spending extra time in the simulator practicing emergency procedures and making pointed comments about their confidence in handling whatever scenarios Tyler might devise. Their behavior reflected the competitive dynamics Tyler had fostered at the school, where student success was measured not just by individual achievement, but by relative performance compared to others. Maria Santos, another instructor at Skyward Academy, approached Chloe privately with a different perspective on the situation. "Tyler's been talking about this challenge for weeks," she said, her voice reflecting years of navigating the school's internal politics. "He's convinced himself that proving you don't belong here will somehow validate his teaching methods and his position as the school's premier instructor." The insight helped Chloe understand that the challenge was about more than her individual performance. Tyler was using her as a symbol of broader changes in aviation that threatened his traditional view of who belonged in professional flying. By discrediting her publicly, he could reinforce existing hierarchies and discourage other non-traditional students from challenging the established order. David Cross, meanwhile, had been quietly reviewing the challenge requirements with the critical eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating pilot competence. His concerns about safety margins proved well-founded as he identified several scenarios that pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk for training purposes, but his objections were dismissed by Captain Hawkins, who deferred to Tyler's expertise in designing challenging but safe evaluation criteria. "Sometimes you have to push students beyond their comfort zones to see what they're really made of," Captain Hawkins explained when David raised specific concerns about altitude requirements and weather minimums. "Tyler knows what he's doing. And frankly, it's time we started maintaining higher standards across the board." The night before the challenge, Chloe found herself reviewing not just the specific requirements, but the broader implications of what she was about to do. Success would likely mean revealing more about her background than she had intended, while failure would confirm every doubt Tyler had expressed about her place in civilian aviation. Either outcome would fundamentally change her status at Skyward Academy and in the broader Cedar Ridge aviation community. She spent the evening going through emergency procedures and mountain flying techniques that felt as familiar as breathing, muscle memory from thousands of hours in far more challenging conditions than anything Tyler could devise. But civilian flying had its own protocols and expectations, and she would need to demonstrate competence within those parameters, rather than relying on military procedures that might appear unorthodox to civilian evaluators. The challenge began at dawn with cross-country navigation, a seemingly straightforward task that Tyler had complicated by requiring pilotage techniques most modern pilots never developed. Participants would fly solo to predetermined checkpoints, using only sectional charts and visual references, with electronic navigation aids disabled and communication limited to essential safety calls. Chloe's preparation for this phase had been thorough but deliberately understated. She had studied the terrain features and prominent landmarks along the route, calculated fuel requirements and time estimates, and planned alternate routes in case weather or other factors required deviations. Her planning process was systematic and professional, but she was careful to avoid displaying the kind of detailed preparation that might suggest military training. Tyler briefed the navigation requirements with obvious satisfaction, emphasizing the difficulty of accurate dead reckoning in mountain terrain and the importance of precise timing to avoid airspace violations. "This isn't GPS flying," he announced to the assembled participants. "This is old-school navigation that separates pilots from button pushers." Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher approached the navigation challenge with confidence born of extensive practice in the local area, but their preparation focused primarily on memorizing landmarks rather than developing systematic navigation techniques. Other participants appeared increasingly nervous as Tyler outlined the precision required and the consequences of significant navigation errors. When Chloe's turn came to demonstrate her navigation planning, she presented a route that was efficient, but not exceptionally so, with checkpoints that were obvious but not necessarily the most challenging available. Her calculations were accurate but not ostentatiously precise, and her backup planning was thorough but not elaborately detailed. To casual observers, her preparation appeared competent but unremarkable. Tyler reviewed her navigation log with obvious skepticism, searching for errors or oversights that might provide early evidence of inadequate preparation. When he found none, his expression suggested disappointment rather than approval, as if accurate planning somehow failed to meet his expectations for dramatic failure. The actual navigation flight revealed capabilities that Chloe had been hiding for months. Her course corrections were minimal and precisely timed. Her altitude control was consistent despite mountain turbulence, and her checkpoint identification was immediate and confident. She flew the route as if following a familiar path rather than navigating unfamiliar terrain, maintaining the kind of situational awareness that comes only from extensive experience. Other participants struggled with various aspects of the navigation challenge. Jake Morrison became disoriented near the halfway point and required radio assistance to re-establish his position, while Ryan Fletcher arrived at his final checkpoint, nearly 10 minutes behind schedule due to course deviations and inefficient routing. Their difficulties highlighted the genuine complexity of the task Tyler had designed, making Chloe's smooth performance appear even more remarkable by comparison. Tyler's evaluation of her navigation flight was grudgingly positive but heavily qualified. Adequate performance, he noted in his records, though the route selected was relatively straightforward and weather conditions were favorable. His comments reflected a determination to minimize her success rather than acknowledge exceptional execution. The precision approach phase proved even more revealing of the participants' actual flying abilities. Tyler had arranged for approaches to be flown in simulated instrument conditions at a mountain airport with challenging terrain and complex procedures. The scenario required not just technical proficiency, but the kind of calm decision-making that comes from extensive experience in demanding conditions. Chloe's approach demonstrated flight control precision that impressed even Tyler, despite his determination to find fault with her performance. Her altitude and course corrections were minimal, her speed control was exact, and her decision to execute a missed approach when simulated wind shear created unstable conditions showed exactly the kind of conservative judgment that professional aviation demanded. The missed approach itself revealed capabilities that Chloe had been carefully concealing throughout her training. Her reaction to the simulated emergency was immediate and correct. Her control inputs were smooth and decisive, and her communication with simulated air traffic control was clear and professional. For several minutes, she flew like someone with far more experience than her logbook indicated, handling the complex scenario with an ease that suggested extensive practice in similar conditions. Tyler's reaction to her performance was visibly conflicted. His professional obligations required him to acknowledge competent flying when he saw it, but his personal agenda demanded finding evidence of inadequacy that would justify his months of criticism. The result was evaluation commentary that praised her technical execution, while questioning her judgment and suggesting that her performance was somehow artificially enhanced by favorable conditions. Jake Morrison's approach attempt ended in a simulated crash when he became disoriented during the missed approach procedure, his altitude control deteriorating rapidly as he struggled with the complex sequence of required actions. Ryan Fletcher managed to complete the approach, but with altitude and course deviations that would have resulted in an automatic failure during an actual check ride. Their difficulties underscored the genuine complexity of the scenarios Tyler had designed, making Chloe's successful completion appear even more significant. The emergency procedures phase proved to be the most revealing component of the entire challenge. Tyler had devised scenarios that required immediate recognition of system failures, followed by precise execution of emergency checklists and successful completion of simulated forced landings. The tests were designed to overwhelm students with multiple simultaneous problems that demanded prioritization and systematic response under pressure. Chloe's performance during emergency scenarios demonstrated a level of competence that could no longer be easily dismissed or minimized. Her system failure diagnoses were immediate and accurate. Her emergency checklist execution was smooth and complete, and her simulated forced landing approach showed the kind of energy management skills that typically required hundreds of hours of experience to develop. More significantly, her verbal communication during these scenarios revealed knowledge that went far beyond typical civilian training. Her radio calls included phraseology and procedural elements that suggested familiarity with emergency protocols most general aviation pilots never encountered. When questioned about specific techniques she employed, her explanations demonstrated understanding of aerodynamic principles and emergency management strategies that were consistent with advanced military or commercial training. Tyler found himself in the uncomfortable position of witnessing performance that exceeded his own capabilities in several areas, particularly in high-stress scenarios that revealed the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. His evaluation comments became increasingly strained as he struggled to maintain his narrative about Chloe's limitations while documenting performance that was objectively superior to other participants. The mountain flying component would prove to be the final and most dramatic phase of Tyler's challenge, but by that point, word of Chloe's exceptional performance had already begun spreading through the aviation community. Pilots who had dismissed her as an overconfident beginner were forced to reconsider their assumptions, while instructors who had supported Tyler's assessment began questioning their own judgment. David Cross, observing the challenge from the sidelines, recognized performance patterns that suggested extensive experience in demanding conditions. His own military background helped him identify techniques and decision-making processes that were characteristic of advanced training, leading him to conclude that Chloe's quiet demeanor had been concealing far more experience than anyone had realized. The revelation created exactly the kind of attention Chloe had been trying to avoid, but it also established her credibility within the aviation community in ways that months of gradual progress never could have achieved. By the end of the second day of challenges, even Tyler was forced to acknowledge that his assumptions about her capabilities had been fundamentally incorrect, setting the stage for confrontations that would ultimately reshape the dynamics at Skyward Aviation Academy. The mountain flying evaluation would take place in the most challenging terrain Colorado had to offer, where density altitude, unpredictable winds, and unforgiving terrain demanded respect from even experienced pilots. Tyler had selected a route through the Front Range that included high-altitude airports, narrow valleys, and terrain features that could generate severe turbulence without warning. The challenge would separate competent pilots from those merely going through the motions of training. Captain Hawkins had reserved the school's twin-engine Beechcraft Baron for the final phase, reasoning that the additional complexity of managing two engines would provide a more comprehensive test of pilot capabilities. The aircraft represented a significant step up from the single-engine trainers most students were familiar with, requiring different techniques for everything from engine management to emergency procedures. Tyler announced the mountain flying requirements with obvious relish, describing scenarios that would push participants beyond their comfort zones and into territory where mistakes could have serious consequences. Mountain flying isn't about following procedures, he declared during the pre-flight briefing. It's about developing the instincts and experience to handle conditions that can't be taught in textbooks or simulators. The weather forecast called for moderate turbulence and variable winds, conditions that would make the challenge genuinely difficult without crossing into truly dangerous territory. Tyler emphasized that any participant could withdraw without penalty, but his tone suggested that declining would be viewed as confirmation of inadequate preparation for serious aviation pursuits. Chloe studied the proposed route with growing certainty that Tyler had designed the challenge specifically to expose what he suspected about her background. The terrain features, altitude requirements, and emergency scenarios were exactly the types of challenges that would be routine for military pilots but potentially overwhelming for civilian students. His strategy seemed designed to force her into revealing capabilities that would raise uncomfortable questions about her training history. Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher approached the mountain flying challenge with considerably less confidence than they had displayed during earlier phases. Their experience in challenging terrain was limited, and the prospect of managing a complex aircraft in demanding conditions clearly concerned them. Their usual bravado had been replaced by nervous energy and careful study of emergency procedures. They hoped not to need. David Cross pulled Chloe aside before the mountain flying evaluation began, his expression reflecting genuine concern about the risks Tyler was introducing into what should have been a training exercise. "This isn't about education anymore," he said quietly. "Tyler's trying to prove something, and he's using dangerous scenarios to do it. You don't have to participate in this." But Chloe had already decided that backing down would accomplish nothing except confirming Tyler's narrative about her limitations. More importantly, she recognized that the mountain flying challenge would finally allow her to demonstrate capabilities she had been hiding for months, regardless of the questions such performance might raise about her background. "I can handle mountain flying," she told David, her tone carrying a confidence that surprised him. "I've been in worse conditions than anything Tyler can arrange around here." The comment revealed more than she had intended, but she was tired of pretending. to be less capable than she actually was. The first phase of the mountain flying evaluation involved high-altitude operations at an airport situated at 8,500 feet elevation, where thin air and challenging approaches tested both aircraft performance and pilot judgment. Tyler would accompany each participant as safety pilot and evaluator, adding the pressure of constant scrutiny to an already demanding flying environment. Chloe's pre-flight preparation for the Baron demonstrated attention to detail that went beyond typical training requirements. Her weight and balance calculations included factors that most civilian pilots overlooked. Her performance charts accounted for variables that suggested extensive experience with high-altitude operations, and her emergency planning covered scenarios that revealed familiarity with complex aircraft systems. Tyler observed her preparation with growing suspicion, noting techniques and considerations that seemed inconsistent with her documented training history. When he questioned specific aspects of her planning, her explanations revealed knowledge of aerodynamic principles and operational procedures that typically required years of experience to develop. "Where did you learn to calculate density-altitude effects on takeoff performance?" Tyler asked, his tone suggesting skepticism about her answer. Chloe's response was technically accurate, but carefully vague, acknowledging self-study without revealing the military training that had made such calculations second nature. The takeoff from Cedar Ridge demonstrated aircraft handling skills that Tyler had never observed during Chloe's previous training flights. Her power management was precise, her directional control was exact, and her rotation technique was smooth and professional. More significantly, her communication with air traffic control included phraseology and procedural elements that suggested extensive experience in controlled airspace. As they climbed toward the high-altitude airport, Tyler began introducing complications designed to test Chloe's ability to handle multiple simultaneous challenges. He reduced power on one engine to simulate a partial power loss, activated warning lights to simulate system malfunctions, and provided vectors that required precise navigation in mountainous terrain where GPS signals were unreliable. Chloe's response to these challenges revealed capabilities that could no longer be concealed or minimized. Her engine failure procedures were immediate and correct. Her system malfunction diagnoses were accurate and systematic, and her navigation techniques demonstrated familiarity with terrain flying that went far beyond civilian training requirements. She handled the complex scenarios with an ease that suggested extensive practice in similar conditions. Tyler found himself in the uncomfortable position of witnessing performance that exceeded his own capabilities in several critical areas. Chloe's energy management during the simulated emergency approach was textbook perfect. Her communication was clear and professional, and her decision-making reflected the kind of conservative judgment that professional aviation demanded. "How long have you actually been flying?" Tyler asked during a brief level-off, his tone reflecting growing certainty that Chloe's training history was more extensive than her records indicated. Her response was carefully non-committal, acknowledging some previous experience without providing specifics that might reveal her military background. The high-altitude landing at the mountain airport demonstrated aircraft control skills that impressed even Tyler despite his determination to find fault with her performance. Her approach was stable and precise, her touchdown was smooth despite gusty crosswinds, and her ground handling showed familiarity with complex aircraft that typically required extensive training to develop. Jake Morrison's attempt at the same approach ended in a go-around when he became overwhelmed by the combination of thin air, challenging terrain, and crosswind conditions. His second approach was successful, but showed significant deviations from optimal technique that would have resulted in criticism during normal training circumstances. Ryan Fletcher managed to complete the landing, but with altitude and airspeed variations that demonstrated his discomfort with the demanding conditions. His ground handling was tentative and imprecise, reflecting unfamiliarity with the aircraft and uncertainty about proper procedures. The contrast between Chloe's smooth performance and the other participants' struggles was becoming impossible to ignore. Pilots observing from the ground began discussing her obvious competence, speculating about training background that could account for such advanced capabilities. Tyler's evaluation of her mountain airport performance was grudgingly positive, but included pointed questions about her previous experience that suggested growing suspicion about her background. His comments focused on techniques that seemed inconsistent with typical civilian training, leading him to conclude that Chloe had been deliberately concealing relevant experience. The return flight to Cedar Ridge would include the most challenging phase of the mountain flying evaluation, requiring navigation through terrain that could generate severe turbulence and weather conditions that might deteriorate rapidly. Tyler had planned a route through narrow valleys and over high ridges that would test spatial awareness and energy management skills under demanding conditions. As they departed the mountain airport, Tyler announced that the final challenge would include a simulated engine failure at a critical phase of flight, requiring immediate decision-making and precise execution of emergency procedures. The scenario was designed to overwhelm pilots with multiple, simultaneous problems that demanded prioritization and systematic response under extreme pressure. Chloe's performance during this phase of the evaluation would finally reveal the full extent of her hidden capabilities. When Tyler simulated the engine failure during climb out from the mountain airport, her response was immediate and correct, demonstrating familiarity with twin-engine emergency procedures that exceeded anything taught in typical civilian training programs. Her emergency checklist execution was smooth and complete. Her communication with simulated air traffic control was clear and professional, and her aircraft handling showed the kind of energy management skills that typically required hundreds of hours of complex aircraft experience to develop. More importantly, her decision-making process revealed systematic training in emergency management that was characteristic of military or airline operations. Tyler watched with growing amazement as Chloe executed a single-engine approach to Cedar Ridge that was textbook perfect in every detail. Her altitude control was precise, her airspeed management was exact, and her landing technique demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded normal civilian training requirements. That was exceptional flying, Tyler admitted as they taxied back to the ramp, his tone reflecting genuine respect despite months of criticism. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" His question was direct and challenging, demanding an explanation for performance that could no longer be dismissed as beginner's luck or favorable conditions. The moment had arrived when Chloe would need to decide whether to continue concealing her background or acknowledge the military training that had shaped her capabilities. Her response would determine not just her status at Skyward Aviation Academy but her entire approach to civilian aviation going forward. Other participants in the Mountain Flying Challenge had struggled with various aspects of the demanding scenarios Tyler had devised. Jake Morrison required instructor assistance during his simulated engine failure, while Ryan Fletcher's emergency approach showed significant deviations from proper technique that would have resulted in an unsatisfactory evaluation under normal circumstances. Word of Chloe's exceptional performance spread quickly through the aviation community, generating exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid throughout her civilian training. Pilots who had dismissed her as an overconfident beginner were forced to reconsider their assumptions, while instructors who had supported Tyler's negative assessments began questioning their own judgment. David Cross, who had observed the mountain flying evaluation from the ground, recognized performance patterns that confirmed his growing suspicion about Chloe's background. Her techniques and decision-making processes were characteristic of advanced military training, leading him to conclude that her quiet demeanor had been concealing extensive experience in demanding operational environments. Captain Hawkins, reviewing the evaluation results, found himself confronting evidence that fundamentally challenged his assumptions about Chloe's capabilities and training background. Her performance exceeded that of students with significantly more documented flight time, suggesting either exceptional natural ability or previous experience that wasn't reflected in her civilian training records. The mountain flying challenge had accomplished Tyler's goal of exposing Chloe's true capabilities, but the revelation created complications he hadn't anticipated. Instead of confirming her inadequacy, the evaluation had demonstrated exceptional competence that raised uncomfortable questions about the accuracy of his previous assessments and the fairness of his instructional approach. Maria Santos, observing the dynamics following the challenge, recognized that Tyler's strategy had backfired dramatically. His attempt to embarrass Chloe publicly had instead revealed her to be one of the most capable pilots at Skyward Aviation Academy, undermining his credibility as an instructor and evaluator. The evening following the mountain flying evaluation, Cedar Ridge's aviation community buzzed with discussion about Chloe's remarkable performance and speculation about training background that could account for such advanced capabilities. The consensus was that her flying skills exceeded those of most civilian pilots with significantly more experience, suggesting either exceptional natural talent or extensive previous training. Tommy Rodriguez, her supervisor at Rocky Mountain Charter, sought her out with obvious pride in her accomplishments, but also concern about the attention her performance had generated. "You flew like someone with a lot more experience than your logbook shows," he said carefully. "Some people are starting to ask questions about where you learned to handle emergencies like that." Lisa Chang approached the situation with more direct curiosity, having observed Chloe's technical knowledge and suspected hidden depths throughout their professional relationship. "That wasn't civilian training," she said bluntly. "Where did you really learn to fly?" Her question was friendly, but persistent, reflecting genuine interest in understanding Chloe's background. The pressure to acknowledge her military experience was mounting from multiple directions, but Chloe remained uncertain about the consequences of revealing her Air Force background. Her original decision to pursue civilian training anonymously had been motivated by a desire to start fresh, but the mountain flying challenge had made continued concealment increasingly difficult. Tyler's behavior following the evaluation reflected his struggle to reconcile months of criticism with evidence of exceptional competence that could no longer be ignored or minimized. His professional obligations required him to acknowledge superior performance when he witnessed it, but his personal investment in proving Chloe's inadequacy made such acknowledgement personally difficult. The situation reached a critical point when Captain Hawkins requested a private meeting with Chloe to discuss her performance during the mountain flying challenge and address growing questions about her training background. His tone suggested that continued evasion about her previous experience would no longer be acceptable given the level of competence she had demonstrated. The meeting would force Chloe to make decisions about her civilian aviation future that she had been postponing throughout her training at Skyward Aviation Academy. The choice between continued concealment and honest acknowledgement of her military background would determine not just her relationship with the school, but her entire approach to rebuilding her aviation career in civilian contexts. The emergency call came through on a Thursday afternoon when autumn winds were gusting across the Colorado Front Range at 30 knots. Creating turbulence that kept most recreational pilots grounded. Chloe was reviewing maintenance schedules in the Rocky Mountain Charter Services office when Tommy Rodriguez burst through the door with an expression of barely controlled panic. "We've got a situation," he announced, his voice tight with urgency. "Medical emergency inbound from Grand Junction. Patient needs immediate transport to Denver. But the weather's deteriorating fast and our regular pilot is stuck in Phoenix with mechanical problems." His eyes swept the room, landing on Chloe with desperate hope. "David Cross is available to fly, but he needs a safety pilot for the conditions we're dealing with. The request represented exactly the kind of exposure Chloe had been trying to avoid throughout her civilian aviation career. Acting as safety pilot on a challenging medical transport would require her to demonstrate capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions about her background, particularly given the demanding weather conditions that were keeping experienced pilots on the ground. But the medical emergency allowed no time for careful consideration of personal consequences. A critically injured construction worker needed immediate transport to trauma facilities that could save his life, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly enough that delaying the flight might eliminate the opportunity entirely. "I'll do it," Chloe said simply, her decision made before she fully considered the implications. The response reflected instincts developed during military service, where mission requirements took precedence over personal concerns and hesitation could mean the difference between life and death for people depending on professional aviation capabilities. David Cross arrived at the airport within minutes, his expression reflecting the focused intensity of someone preparing for a challenging flight under pressure. His briefing covered weather conditions, aircraft performance requirements, and emergency procedures with the systematic thoroughness of a pilot who understood the risks involved in the proposed mission. Winds are gusting to 40 knots with severe turbulence reported through the mountain passes, David explained as they reviewed weather data. "We'll be flying the twin Cessna, which handles turbulence well, but the patient's condition is critical. Enough that we can't afford delays or route deviations that might compromise medical care." The aircraft assigned to the mission was a Cessna 421, a pressurized twin-engine plane, capable of flying above much of the turbulence that was making the flight challenging for smaller aircraft. But the high-performance airplane required advanced techniques for single-engine operations and emergency procedures that went well beyond typical civilian training requirements. Chloe's pre-flight inspection of the Cessna revealed familiarity with complex aircraft systems that impressed David. Despite his focus on mission preparation, her checks were systematic and thorough, covering systems and components that many pilots overlooked, and her questions about aircraft performance reflected understanding of operational considerations that typically required extensive experience to develop. "You seem comfortable with complex aircraft," David observed as they completed their pre-flight procedures. "Have you flown twins before?" His question was casual but perceptive, reflecting growing curiosity about capabilities that seemed inconsistent with her documented civilian training history. The medical team arrived as they were completing their aircraft preparation, bringing equipment and personnel that would provide critical care during the flight to Denver. The patient's condition was indeed serious, requiring continuous monitoring and immediate access to trauma facilities that could provide surgical intervention. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the flight physician coordinating medical care, briefed them on the patient's condition and the importance of smooth flight operations that wouldn't compromise ongoing treatment. Any significant turbulence or aggressive maneuvering could be life-threatening, she explained. "We need the most stable flight profile possible under these conditions." The departure from Cedar Ridge took place in gusty crosswinds that challenged even experienced pilots, but Chloe's assistance during taxi and takeoff procedures demonstrated aircraft handling skills that exceeded David's expectations. Her control inputs were precise and anticipatory, suggesting familiarity with challenging conditions that went beyond typical civilian experience. As they climbed toward cruising altitude, the weather conditions proved every bit as demanding as forecasted. Moderate to severe turbulence buffeted the aircraft continuously, requiring constant attention to flight controls and frequent adjustments to maintain stable flight. The challenging conditions demanded the kind of crew coordination and workload management that typically required extensive training to develop effectively. Chloe's performance as safety pilot revealed capabilities that could no longer be concealed. Through careful understatement, Her instrument scan was systematic and comprehensive. Her radio communications were clear and professional, and her monitoring of aircraft systems showed attention to detail that reflected advanced training in huisveining in complex aircraft operations. More significantly, her situational awareness and decision-making during the flight demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that characterized professional aviation training. When David encountered difficulty maintaining altitude in severe downdrafts, Chloe's suggestions for power adjustments and configuration changes proved exactly correct for the conditions they were experiencing. "Your recommendations are spot on," David told her during a brief respite from the worst turbulence. "Where did you learn crew resource management techniques like that?" His question reflected growing certainty that Chloe's training background was more extensive than her civilian records indicated. The flight progressed smoothly despite challenging weather conditions. But the real test came when they were 30 minutes from Denver and David suddenly slumped forward in his seat, unconscious from what appeared to be a medical emergency of his own. The situation transformed instantly from a challenging but routine medical transport into a crisis that required immediate action to prevent disaster. Chloe's response to David's sudden incapacitation revealed the full extent of her hidden capabilities. Her assumption of aircraft control was immediate and smooth, demonstrating familiarity with emergency procedures that clearly exceeded normal civilian training requirements. Within seconds, she had established stable flight, declared an emergency with air traffic control, and begun systematic evaluation of their options for continuing the mission. Denver approach, Cessna 421 November has a pilot medical emergency, she transmitted with professional calm that betrayed no hint of panic or uncertainty. Request priority handling for immediate approach to Denver International. We have a critically injured patient on board, requiring immediate medical attention. Her communication with air traffic control demonstrated familiarity with emergency procedures and phraseology that suggested extensive experience in challenging situations. More importantly, her voice carried the kind of calm authority that comes only from systematic training in crisis management and confidence born of extensive experience under pressure. Dr. Walsh, monitoring both patients while Chloe flew the aircraft, was amazed by the smooth transition and professional handling of what could have been a catastrophic situation. "How are you maintaining such stable flight in these conditions?" she asked, her medical training making her acutely aware of how aircraft control difficulties could compromise patient care. The approach to Denver International Airport proved to be the most challenging phase of the entire flight. Gusty winds and complex traffic patterns required precise navigation and aircraft control under conditions that would challenge even experienced airline pilots. But Chloe's performance demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded anything taught in civilian training programs. Her approach was stable and precise despite challenging conditions. Her communication with air traffic control was clear and professional, and her aircraft handling showed the kind of energy management skills that typically required hundreds of hours of complex aircraft experience to develop. Most importantly, her decision-making throughout the emergency reflected systematic training in crisis management that was characteristic of military or airline operations. The landing at Denver was smooth and professional, accomplished with precision that impressed ground personnel who had been monitoring the emergency situation. Emergency medical teams were waiting as they taxied to the ramp, ready to continue care for both the original patient and David, who had regained consciousness during the approach but remained weak and disoriented. As medical personnel took charge of patient care, Chloe found herself surrounded by airport operations staff, FAA representatives, and airline pilots who had monitored the emergency approach with professional interest. Her handling of the crisis had generated exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid throughout her civilian aviation career. That was exceptional flying under extremely challenging conditions, commented Captain Richards, a United Airlines pilot who had observed the approach from the terminal. "Your crew resource management and emergency procedures were textbook perfect. What's your background?" His question was direct and professional, reflecting genuine admiration for competence demonstrated under pressure. The FAA representative conducting the preliminary incident investigation was equally impressed by Chloe's performance and curious about training background that could account for such advanced capabilities. "Emergency assumption of aircraft control in complex aircraft isn't something most civilian pilots train for," he noted. "Your response was immediate and correct, suggesting extensive experience with similar scenarios." Dr. Walsh, accompanying David to the hospital for evaluation, took time to thank Chloe for the professional handling that had likely saved multiple lives. "Your flying skills and calm decision-making made it possible to complete this mission, despite impossible circumstances," she said. "I've flown with airline pilots who couldn't have handled that situation as well." The praise was gratifying but also concerning, given Chloe's ongoing efforts to maintain a low profile within the civilian aviation community. The emergency flight had demonstrated capabilities that could no longer be concealed through careful understatement, forcing her to confront questions about her background that she had been avoiding for months. News of the successful emergency flight spread rapidly through Colorado's aviation community, generating discussion about Chloe's remarkable performance and speculation about training background that could account for such advanced capabilities. The consensus among professional pilots was that her flying skills and decision-making reflected extensive experience in demanding operational environments. Tyler Hawkins, learning about the emergency flight through airport communications, found himself confronting evidence that fundamentally challenged every assumption he had made about Chloe's capabilities. Her performance during the medical emergency exceeded that of most civilian pilots with significantly more documented flight time, suggesting either exceptional natural ability or extensive previous training. Captain Hawkins, receiving reports about the incident from multiple sources, realized that his assessment of Chloe's abilities had been fundamentally incorrect. The emergency flight had revealed competence that clearly exceeded normal civilian training requirements, raising questions about his judgment as an evaluator and the accuracy of his nephew's instructional assessments. Tommy Rodriguez, monitoring the flight from Rocky Mountain Charter Services, felt immense pride in Chloe's performance, but also concern about the exposure her heroic actions had generated. "You saved lives today," he told her when she returned to Cedar Ridge the following morning. "But people are asking serious questions about where you learned to fly like that." The emergency had forced Chloe into exactly the kind of high-profile situation she had been trying to avoid, but it had also demonstrated the value of her military training in civilian contexts where lives depended on professional competence. The successful completion of the mission under impossible circumstances provided undeniable evidence of capabilities that could no longer be dismissed or minimized. David Cross, recovering in the hospital but stable, sent word through Dr. Walsh, expressing his gratitude for Chloe's professional handling of the emergency. "She saved my life and completed the mission," his message read. "Her flying skills are exceptional, and her decision-making under pressure was exactly what the situation required." The incident had created a turning point that would force Chloe to make fundamental decisions about her civilian aviation future. The choice between continued concealment of her military background and honest acknowledgement of her extensive training would determine not just her relationship with Skyward Aviation Academy, but her entire approach to professional aviation going forward. Local media had picked up the story of the dramatic medical emergency and successful flight completion despite challenging conditions, generating public attention that made continued anonymity increasingly difficult. Television news reports and newspaper articles focused on the heroic actions of the mysterious pilot, who had saved lives through exceptional flying skills and professional competence. The story resonated with the general public in ways that typical aviation incidents rarely achieved, creating interest in Chloe's background that extended well beyond the professional aviation community. Her quiet competence and humble response to praise generated exactly the kind of positive attention that military veterans often avoided, but civilian communities valued highly. Airport operations staff who had witnessed her performance during the emergency approach began discussing her obvious competence with colleagues throughout the Denver aviation community. Word spread through professional networks that the quiet student pilot from Cedar Ridge had demonstrated flying skills that exceeded those of most commercial pilots, generating curiosity about her training background. The FAA's preliminary investigation of the incident focused primarily on the medical emergency that had incapacitated David, but investigators also noted the exceptional performance of the safety pilot who had assumed control and completed the mission successfully. Their report would become part of official records that documented Chloe's capabilities under the most challenging possible circumstances. Flight instructors and aviation professionals throughout Colorado began discussing the incident as an example of exceptional airmanship and professional competence demonstrated under pressure. The consensus was that Chloe's performance reflected training and experience that went far beyond typical civilian requirements, leading to widespread speculation about her actual background. The emergency flight had accomplished what months of careful training and deliberate anonymity could not prevent. Chloe's military capabilities had been revealed in the most public and dramatic way possible, forcing her to confront the fundamental question of how to integrate her past experience with her civilian aviation future. The transformation at Skyward Aviation Academy began the morning after news reports about the emergency medical flight aired across Colorado. Students and instructors who had previously dismissed Chloe gathered around the television in the pilot lounge, watching footage of her calm interview with local reporters and listening to praise from medical professionals whose lives she had helped save. Tyler Hawkins stood at the back of the crowd, his expression unreadable as he heard himself indirectly criticized by aviation professionals commenting on the incident. "Whoever trained this pilot did an exceptional job," noted Captain Martinez from Frontier Airlines during the televised interview. Her response to the emergency was immediate and professional, suggesting extensive experience in high-pressure situations. The comment stung because Tyler recognized its implicit criticism of his own assessment abilities. For months, he had dismissed Chloe as an inadequate student pilot, missing obvious signs of advanced training that should have been apparent to any competent flight instructor. His credibility as an evaluator was now being questioned throughout the aviation community. Captain Hawkins emerged from his office with a stack of phone messages and emails, all asking about Chloe's training background and availability for employment opportunities. Airlines, charter services, and corporate flight departments had begun making inquiries about the pilot whose emergency performance had impressed aviation professionals across the region. "We need to talk," Captain Hawkins told Chloe when she arrived at the airport later that morning. His tone was respectful rather than authoritative, reflecting a fundamental shift in their relationship that acknowledged her demonstrated competence. "There are some questions about your background that I think we need to address honestly." The conversation that followed would finally force Chloe to acknowledge the military training she had been concealing throughout her civilian aviation career. Sitting in Captain Hawkins' office, surrounded by photographs and certificates that documented his own impressive flying background, she made the decision to reveal the experience that explained her exceptional capabilities. "I served 5 years as a remotely piloted aircraft specialist with the Air Force," Chloe said simply, her voice carrying quiet pride rather than boastfulness. "One flew over 2,000 hours in combat operations, including missions in contested airspace where split-second decisions were the difference between mission success and failure." The revelation recontextualized everything Captain Hawkins thought he knew about Chloe's training progress and Tyler's instructional assessments. Her supposed struggles with basic procedures had actually been unfamiliarity with civilian protocols rather than fundamental skill deficiencies. Her quiet demeanor had concealed extensive experience in far more challenging conditions than anything civilian aviation typically demanded. "Why didn't you mention this when you started training here?" Captain Hawkins asked, though his tone suggested understanding rather than criticism. "Your military background would have qualified you for advanced training programs that could have accelerated your civilian certification significantly." Chloe's explanation revealed the complexity of transitioning from military to civilian aviation, particularly for someone seeking to build a new identity separate from past service. "I wanted to start fresh," she explained. "My military experience felt like a different life, and I wasn't sure how civilian aviation would accept someone with my background." The conversation was interrupted when Tyler knocked on the office door, his expression suggesting he had heard enough of their discussion to understand the situation. His request to join the conversation was granted reluctantly, setting up the confrontation that would finally address months of systematic criticism and professional misjudgment. "I owe you an apology," Tyler said immediately, his characteristic confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "Everything I said about your flying abilities was wrong, and I should have recognized signs of advanced training that were obvious in retrospect." His admission represented a fundamental acknowledgement of his failure as an instructor and evaluator. But Chloe's response surprised both men with its measured professionalism and lack of vindictiveness. "You evaluated me based on the information you had," she said simply. "I deliberately concealed relevant experience, which made accurate assessment impossible." Her willingness to accept responsibility for the miscommunication demonstrated the kind of mature leadership that military service had developed. The discussion that followed established new ground rules for Chloe's continued training at Skyward Aviation Academy. Her military experience would be officially acknowledged and credited toward her civilian certification requirements, accelerating her progress toward commercial pilot credentials. More importantly, her demonstrated expertise would be utilized to enhance the school's training programs. Captain Hawkins offered her a position as an instructor specializing in emergency procedures and crew resource management, recognizing that her combat experience provided valuable perspectives on decision-making under pressure. The offer represented a complete reversal of the dismissive treatment she had endured throughout her student pilot experience. "Your military background brings credibility to our emergency training that we haven't had before," Captain Hawkins explained. "Students need to learn from someone who has actually managed life and death situations, not just simulated them." His recognition of her value reflected broader changes in aviation training that increasingly emphasized real-world experience over theoretical knowledge. Tyler's role in these developments was more complex, requiring him to confront his own biases and professional shortcomings while maintaining his position at the school. His uncle's decision to restructure instructional responsibilities reflected recognition that Tyler's assessment abilities needed significant improvement before he could be trusted with advanced students. "I'd like to work with you on developing better evaluation techniques," Tyler told Chloe during a private conversation following the meeting with Captain Hawkins. "My assumptions about student capabilities clearly need adjustment, and I think your perspective could help me become a better instructor." His request for mentorship represented remarkable personal growth for someone accustomed to being the unquestioned authority. The broader transformation at Skyward Aviation Academy reflected changes that extended throughout Cedar Ridge's aviation community. Chloe's emergency flight had demonstrated the value of military-trained pilots in civilian contexts, leading to increased recruitment efforts targeting veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Rocky Mountain Charter Services offered her position as chief pilot, recognizing that her combined military experience and civilian training made her uniquely qualified to manage complex operations. Tommy Rodriguez was enthusiastic about the possibility of having someone with her background leading their flight operations. "You understand both the technical aspects and the human factors that make aviation safe," Tommy explained during their discussion about the position. "Your experience managing high-stress situations would be invaluable for our charter operations, especially the medical flights we handle regularly." But Chloe found herself most interested in the teaching opportunities that her revealed background had created. Working with students who were struggling with confidence or technical challenges appealed to her desire to help others succeed, while honoring the legacy of instructors who had shaped her own development. Her first class at Skyward Aviation Academy focused on emergency procedures and decision-making under pressure, topics where her military experience provided unique insights into systematic approaches to crisis management. The students, including Jake Morrison and Ryan Fletcher, attended with respectful attention that contrasted sharply with their previous dismissive attitudes. "Real emergencies don't follow textbook scenarios," Chloe explained during her first lecture. "Your response needs to be systematic and prioritized, but also flexible enough to adapt to unexpected complications." Her teaching style emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge, reflecting lessons learned through actual experience rather than simulated training. Jake Morrison approached her after class with obvious embarrassment about his previous behavior and genuine interest in learning from her experience. "I never realized how much I didn't know about actual emergency management," he admitted. "Could you work with me on developing better situational awareness?" His request reflected sincere desire for improvement rather than superficial politeness. Ryan Fletcher's transformation was even more dramatic as he recognized that Chloe's quiet competence represented exactly the kind of professional attitude he needed to develop for serious aviation pursuits. "I've been focused on looking like a pilot instead of actually becoming one," he told her during a mentoring session. "How do I develop the kind of real confidence you demonstrate?" The changes at Skyward Aviation Academy attracted attention from aviation professionals throughout Colorado, who recognized the value of incorporating military experience into civilian training programs. Flight schools across the region began recruiting veteran pilots for instructional positions, acknowledging that combat experience provided perspectives on risk management that traditional civilian training often lacked. David Cross recovered from his medical emergency and cleared to return to flying duties, became one of Chloe's strongest advocates within the aviation community. His first-hand experience of her capabilities during the crisis provided powerful testimony about the value of military-trained pilots in civilian emergency situations. "She saved my life and completed a critical mission under impossible circumstances," David told anyone who would listen. Her decision-making and technical skills under pressure were exactly what the situation required. His endorsement carried significant weight within professional aviation circles. Dr. Walsh, the flight physician who had witnessed Chloe's performance during the medical emergency, became an advocate for incorporating military veterans into civilian medical transport operations. "The systematic approach to crisis management that military pilots bring is exactly what we need for high-stakes medical flights," she argued in professional publications. The Mountain Pilots Association invited Chloe to speak at their monthly meeting, providing a forum for her to share insights about transitioning from military to civilian aviation. Her presentation focused on the challenges veterans faced in adapting to different operational environments while maintaining the professional standards military service had instilled. Military aviation teaches systematic approaches to decision-making that translate well to civilian operations, Chloe explained to the audience of experienced pilots. But civilian aviation has its own culture and procedures that require respect and adaptation. Her balanced perspective on both environments resonated with pilots from diverse backgrounds. The presentation led to consulting opportunities with aviation companies seeking to improve their safety programs and emergency response procedures. Chloe's unique combination of military operational experience and civilian training made her valuable for organizations trying to bridge the gap between different aviation cultures. Tyler's redemption arc proved more challenging, but ultimately successful as he worked to overcome the biases and assumptions that had led to his misjudgment of Chloe's capabilities. His collaboration with her on developing improved evaluation techniques helped him become a more effective instructor while acknowledging his previous shortcomings. I learned that quiet competence is often more valuable than flashy confidence, Tyler reflected during a faculty meeting months later. Chloe taught me to look beyond surface presentations and evaluate actual performance objectively. His growth as an instructor reflected broader changes in aviation training that emphasized substance over style. The relationship between Tyler and Chloe evolved into a professional partnership that combined his civilian training expertise with her military operational experience. Their collaborative approach to instruction proved particularly effective for students struggling with confidence issues or advanced emergency procedures. Captain Hawkins implemented systematic changes to Skyward Aviation Academy's evaluation procedures, ensuring that future students with non-traditional backgrounds would be assessed fairly rather than dismissed based on preconceptions. The reforms reflected recognition that aviation was becoming more diverse and required instructional approaches that accommodated different learning styles and experience levels. We missed an exceptional pilot because we made assumptions about capabilities based on demographics rather than performance, Captain Hawkins explained to other flight school owners during an industry conference. Our evaluation procedures needed fundamental revision to identify talent regardless of background. The Academy's reputation for excellence in emergency training attracted students from across the region, many specifically seeking instruction from Chloe and her colleagues who brought real-world experience to civilian training environments. The waiting list for advanced courses grew substantially as word spread about the quality of instruction available. Chloe's personal growth throughout these experiences reflected the successful integration of her military background with civilian aviation pursuits. She began wearing her father's dog tags openly, no longer hiding the military service that had shaped her capabilities and character. The visible symbols of her background sparked conversations with other veterans who were considering aviation careers. Military service provides excellent preparation for aviation careers, she would tell veterans considering civilian flight training. The systematic thinking and decision-making skills translate directly, but you need to respect civilian procedures and culture while maintaining professional standards. Her mentorship helped numerous veterans successfully transition to civilian aviation careers. The aviation community's response to Chloe's story reflected broader recognition of the value military veterans brought to civilian operations. Airlines and charter services began actively recruiting former military pilots, acknowledging that combat experience provided unique perspectives on risk management and emergency response. Her emergency flight was eventually featured in Aviation Safety publications as an example of exceptional crew resource management and decision-making under pressure. The case study emphasized how proper training and systematic approaches to crisis management could produce successful outcomes, even in seemingly impossible circumstances. The story resonated throughout American aviation as an example of hidden competence revealed through challenging circumstances. Pilots across the country recognized the broader lesson about not judging capabilities based on demographics or preconceptions, leading to improved evaluation procedures at training institutions nationwide. Maria Santos, observing the transformations at Skyward Aviation Academy, noted how Chloe's revelation had improved the overall culture and quality of instruction. She showed us that excellence comes in many forms, Maria reflected. Our job as instructors is to recognize and develop capabilities wherever we find them, not to impose narrow definitions of what pilots should look like. The positive changes extended beyond individual relationships to systematic improvements in how the aviation community identified and developed talent. Flight schools across Colorado adopted evaluation procedures that focused on demonstrated competence rather than subjective assessments of potential, reducing the likelihood that qualified candidates would be overlooked due to bias or preconceptions. Chloe's integration into Cedar Ridge's aviation community became complete when she was elected to the board of the Mountain Pilots Association, providing her with a platform to advocate for inclusive training practices and support for military veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Her quiet leadership style proved effective in building consensus around initiatives that benefited the entire aviation community. The long-term impact of her story extended far beyond individual relationships or single institutions. Aviation publications featured articles about the importance of recognizing diverse backgrounds and experience levels, while training organizations implemented systematic changes to ensure fair evaluation of all students, regardless of demographics. Her grandmother's letter, which had sustained her through challenging periods in both military and civilian aviation, took on new meaning as Chloe realized how Eleanor's wisdom about trusting training and judgment had proven prophetic. The sky truly didn't care about background or preconceptions, only about competence and professionalism demonstrated through actual performance. Years later, when Chloe had established herself as one of Colorado's most respected aviation professionals, she would reflect on how the emergency medical flight had transformed not just her own career, but the entire culture at Skyward Aviation Academy. The incident had forced everyone involved to confront their assumptions and prejudices, ultimately creating a more inclusive and effective training environment. The quiet student pilot who had once been dismissed as inadequate had become a leader whose example influenced aviation training throughout the region. Her story served as a reminder that excellence often comes disguised as ordinary competence, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal capabilities that had been present all along. The transformation was complete when Tyler, now a more effective instructor thanks to Chloe's mentorship, told new students about the importance of respecting every person's potential, regardless of their apparent background. You never know when the quiet student in the corner might be the most capable pilot in the room, he would say, sharing the lesson that had fundamentally changed his approach to instruction. Chloe's emergency that day at 10,000 feet had saved lives and revealed truth about capabilities hidden beneath quiet professionalism. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that the aviation community was strongest when it recognized excellence wherever it appeared and created environments where all pilots could develop their full potential. The story became legend within Colorado aviation circles, told and retold as an example of how crisis reveals character and competence. But for those who lived it, the real lesson was simpler and more profound. Never underestimate the quiet professional who keeps their capabilities private until circumstances demand their revelation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.